Okay, so it's a semi-presidential system. And in starting out talking about this, one thing I want to emphasize is that much like our own system, which has seen a gradual evolution in the way our government is managed without any constitutional change ever having actually occurred, right? Think about how many executive orders happen now, right? Like how much of our government is just run just right out of the executive branch now, right? This isn't, the Constitution wasn't changed or something. It's just gradually, in order to govern the country, this is just kind of the way that it evolved. The same thing has happened in France under the Fifth Republic. Nothing has constitutionally really been altered in 40, 50 years, but gradually it has come to be that the president is largely in charge by virtue of his ability to pick the premier, the prime minister, I'm going to call that. If you look in your book, there's a nice explanation of all this on page 87. If you don't love all of the many arrows here, which really it is a little more complicated looking than maybe it needs to be for a surface level understanding. In the Fifth Republic, so we have what's called a semi-presidential. Semi-presidential. And it's semi-presidential because the voters here are choosing the president. This is the citizenry right down here. Hello. There's a citizenry right down here. They're voting for the president. Okay? But the president is not really doing the governing. The president is then choosing the government. When we talk about the government, we're talking about the cabinet. That is the premier, the prime minister, and all the different cabinet ministers who actually run the government. So when they say that the government has lost a vote of confidence, what it means is that the president's people, who they've put together, have been censured by the other people that the French citizens vote for, which is the National Assembly. Okay? Now, oddly, the National Assembly, by design of the Fifth French Republic, doesn't have a lot of the customary powers that we think of a legislative branch as having, for example, like creating a budget, right? Our own Congress stinks at it, haven't produced a balanced budget in any of your lifetimes, but they are in charge of the budget. The president can't just say, this is the budget this year. We have to wait until the very last second and pass a huge omnibus bill, because that's just the proper way to do it. No, in France, by design, de Gaulle essentially said, we're going to skip over all of that. The president has the power to appoint the government, and the government can simply pass the budget. That's not something that the legislature is going to be involved in. The actual financing and running of the country is something that the government is going to take care of. That's why they're the government. However, as we're going to see, you have to be careful, because if you alienate Parliament, they can censure the government. Essentially, it's like a no-confidence vote. Destroys the government. So when it says, the government has collapsed or lost a vote of no confidence, that's what it means. It means that they were governing in a way that made enough people angry here. And if you think about it, we want to have our coalition hats on here, our multi-party democracy hats on here. Very rarely is a party going to win a majority. We said once we left the shores of Great Britain, we weren't going to encounter a lot of two-party systems anymore. We were going to get very messy coalitions. So it's very rare for you to just have an outright majority of the seats. So you need to be very careful with the kinds of bills and laws and budgets that you're passing. Because if you alienate, because some of these people hate you. Like some of these are just pure opposition, don't like you at all. Others are conditionally allowing your government to hang around as long as you don't touch something that they really like. For example, one of the really fraught ones, gosh, just 2023, the Parisians were out in the streets rioting and trying to burn things down again because Macron's government wanted to raise the retirement age from 62 to 70. No, I'm just kidding, to 64. From 62 to 64. Because France's financial situation is absolutely terrible, very bad, and so they rioted in the street, and to try and get them to back down. That was also the Yellow Vest protests from, that would have been periodically from 2018, 2019. And again, this was because the government was trying to impose a tax on the people, because they need to balance the budget. And so if you can't cut spending, because that's what raising the retirement age is about, right? They want to cut their entitlement spending. And if you can't raise taxes, well, you're kind of stuck, aren't you? And that is essentially going to be the story that we get to when we talk about the various governments. I'm not going to really go too much into like de Gaulle and Mitterrand and all of those going way back. I will speak on them briefly just in terms of how they relate to all this now. We're mostly going to spend a good 30, 40 minutes talking about the present day politics of France, I would say probably last 15 years, because what we'll see when we talk about these things is how a lot of the same political phenomena pop up in the same country. You know, we talked about how Thatcher and Reagan came along at the same time, espousing the same ideas to solve the same sorts of problems. And you had the same thing going on in France. And you have the left moving towards the center to be more friendly to business. You have that going on in the United States under Clinton. You had that going on under Blair and the New Labour Party. And you're going to have that going on here as well under Mitterrand, who was technically a socialist. But his first several years of governing as a socialist were absolutely abysmal, and so he basically just allowed himself to be pulled toward the center there. And so it's interesting, we're going to see a similar thing happen in the last 15, 20 years. Gosh, it's already almost been 20 years. Really, the great financial crisis. It was the great delegitimizer, if you will. There was this solid consensus. I believe in the book here, he calls it the neoliberal consensus about how to run government, essentially. Neoliberal is not the most solidly scholastic word, but we'll just roll with it because he uses it. But this was all kind of exploded in the global financial crisis and the recession. And then in Europe, I believe I mentioned last week or 2 weeks ago, that carried on. They had a rolling crisis well into the 2010s. We didn't really stop seeing the tremors of that financial crisis until like 2013, 2014. But it really delegitimized the establishment in the same way that mismanagement of foreign policy and the economy delegitimized the American establishment and the British establishment. And the Brexit vote, the Trump vote. We're going to be introduced to someone called the National Rally. The National Rally is sort of that right populist response to that that's been growing. I mentioned the AfD in Germany. That's another right populist group that's really benefited from this sort of left, center-left consensus that's been really dominant for all of your lifetimes, really. And so we're going to see how that's been handled in France, because really Macron is exactly that guy. He is exactly that guy. He had never been elected to an office before he wins the presidential election in 2018. But he was a technocrat from the finance ministries, and he is exactly that sort of guy. And he is really, we're going to see, stuck right in the middle of these national rally populist right people and these real hardcore socialist leftists, and he and his people are just very much sandwiched in between them. And we'll talk about the sort of politics that he's tried to play to stay in power here in a few minutes. So we have the voters. Let's just review. We have the voters. They are choosing the president. The president then picks a prime minister, premier. The premier assigns ministers to the different portfolios: finance, transportation, education, etc. And they run the government. And so when I talk about the government, that's who I'm talking about. Any questions on that? Okay, they pass the budgets, make most of the rules. Okay, so the voters also vote for the National Assembly. That's what this is right here, this mess. I'll get to this in just a second. Now, the National Assembly's way to exert power on the government, and what they're doing is by voting to censure them. I will say a couple words about the Constitutional Council and the Senate, but they're really very, very unimportant. As unimportant as the House of Lords was, and the English courts, like these are even less important. And I will talk about what it is. Talk about this really quick before I talk about how elections actually work in France, because it's a really interesting, it's a 2-round runoff system. It's very interesting. It's single district, but it's 2-round, and there's a bunch of parties, and so there's a lot of wheeling and dealing and horse trading that goes on. So what we have here on the top is the results of, this was this summer's one. This was 2024's summer National Assembly elections, which I'll get to Macron foolishly calling that election. But this was it, right here. But then, you see this other one, results by coalition or alliance. Yes?
How often are they re-elected?
Oh, they hold elections every 5 years. But the president can call for elections anytime, really. But it's a huge gamble. It's a huge gamble. Because if you're in power, that means the elections occur very close to each other. Like a couple months, really. Like in 23 when he won re-election, that was in, I think, March. And then in June were the National Assembly election. So the idea here is that whoever won, whatever guy or gal won the presidency, they're going to be popular enough that their party is going to win a lot of seats here. And so, if you then call for another election, it's a huge risk. And the several times recently that's happened, it's totally bit the president right in the butt, which is exactly what happened to Macron. Because what you're doing is you're trying to feel the pulse of the public. And you're saying, ooh, I think they're loving me right now. And if I call for elections right now, I'm going to grow my majority even more. But you could also lose seats, which is what's happened recently. I think this past year, and then I think the last time someone tried to do that was 97. And I think it was Chirac who did it. And the same thing happened. So, you can call for elections. You can call for snap elections, but it's a risk. Because you're doing it because your life is difficult, ostensibly. You want to make it easier, but at the same time, it can make your life a lot harder. So it's a gamble. And as you can see here, so there's party, right? Results by party. And I'm actually going to pull up the party thing in just a minute here to show you all the different parties that they have. But then there's results by coalition or alliance. And so you basically have a left alliance, a right alliance, and a centrist alliance. Okay? Okay. And when I say like coalition and alliance, we're going to see that. I actually mean that they like get together and say, okay, don't run your guy in this district here because the candidate from this party looks really solid, and if we both run, he might win an outright majority, and that would be a disaster for us. So I'm going to drop out. So we'll drop our person out of this district if you drop your person out of that district. Yeah. So it's very interesting. So let's actually go to the. Yeah, right. Like that's a nice, neat electoral map, right? So these are all parties. As we can see here, some of the parties are more important than others, obviously. Let's talk a little bit about the districts here, and then I'll say a little bit about the parties. Yeah, I'll just say something about the parties now and their ideologies. I wish my markers weren't dying so badly so I could use different colors. Maybe I can. I have a red, which I will obviously use for the reds. So, we've got our socialists here. Socialism, very strong in France. Actually, the communists were huge in France until the 1970s, really. Really, it was the 1970s. The Communist Party of France was huge. I mean, and this goes back to, I have something here about Vichy collaborationists and stuff. As I said, the French government surrenders to the Nazis, and then many of them collaborate with the Nazis. And if you read the writings of the time, newspapers, things, it was, well, better the Nazis than the commies and the socialists. So most of the resistance fighters, especially from 41 onward, after Germany invades the Soviet Union, the home of world communism, the underground insurgency is mostly commies and socialists. They're the ones who get all the cred. It's not de Gaulle and those guys, they don't show up until they're in the baggage train of the Allies. So most of the actual people on the ground doing the fighting and the dying and the sabotaging are commies. And the same thing is true in Italy. It's one of the reasons that the US State Department works super, super, super hard to undermine and destroy the commie party of Italy in the run-up to the first series of elections. Because the idea was that Italy is just too important to go communist. And it looked like the Communist Party was going to win in Italy. And so they engaged in like a big, so we had like a big Italian-American community. So they had this big like postcard campaign, like write to your relatives back in the home country and tell them what a disaster it would be if the commies win. You know, they need to vote for the Christian Democrats. And you know, Operation Gladio is what it was called, Gladio, Operation Gladio, Operation Stay Behind. You can read about it if you want. It's interesting. Just injury. Yeah.
As like people in France found that having a bunch of different parties makes them like their candidate at all.
Like their what?
Like that the government is working for them better at all.
No, and we're going to see that parties really come and go. Like, that's what's funny, is if you look in your book, this book is not even that old. Like, a bunch of these parties aren't even in there. Parties come and go, and it's something that he points out in here on page... What page? So I remember he pointed it out, and I was like, I'm glad that he pointed this out, because parties are just not... And part of it is, look how many governments there have been, right? Look how many governments they've been through. On page 86, you've got, since 1789, you've had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. You've had 12 different governments. You've had 15 different constitutions. You've had like 100 different political parties. Yeah.
So I had a question. So why, like, is the French like political society just like against, like, not like forming a coalition, but like making it a party name? Does that make sense? Like, why aren't more of the parties willing to be like, well, if we both come together and we like, you know, put all of our little seats under one, you know, party name, we'd have more power, we'd have more influence. Why do we make coalitions when we can just put them all into a party?
That's a great question. And actually, I know this looks ridiculous. It's actually an improvement over 20 years ago. There has been an era. And there are some political scientists who think that France might kind of be headed towards basically a two-party, 2+1 type situation, what we have in the UK. It's just that the way the electoral system, a lot of it has to do with how the electoral system is structured, which is what we're going to talk about next. A lot of it just has to do with that. It doesn't force you into a two-party system, like a winner-take-all, presidential, single-party, or single-member districts really increases the likelihood that you will wind up with a two-party system. Like, the founders didn't sit down and say, like, no, it's going to be a two-party system, and it's just, these factions just formed, and it's just been a consistently two-party system throughout. You know, you get occasional third parties, but they're usually issue parties, right? The know-nothings, that was an anti-immigrant party. Hated the Catholics and the Irish, mostly. They hated other people too. They were equal opportunity haters in many ways. They spread the hate around. You had the Bull Moose Party. That main issue was that they wanted Teddy Roosevelt to be president, and that was it. That was the whole issue. It was Teddy Roosevelt's our guy. And they wound up handing the election to Woodrow Wilson. Let's see, the Green Party, that's a thing. It's very marginal, but yeah. So they tend to be like very issue focused. And again, here, in this case, they are very, very issue driven. And that's why there can be coalitions between them, between these various left groups here. But, and actually the super left aren't even on here, are they? No, they're not on this one. But part of it is personality. A lot of these people know each other. There's often, you know, a little bit of turfism going on. Turfism, you know what that is? Everybody's trying to fight to defend their little area of turf. Like, this is my party. This is our platform. You know, I'm in charge. There is some of that goes on. But yeah, they do, and again, they do come together to form coalitions regularly. because there are a lot of overlapping interests. But if you look here, these descriptions of party position are pretty accurate here, pretty accurate. And so you see the left wing here, the actual left wing party, they control a lot of seats, and they're the type who would say, and I know this is going to strike you guys as very radical, but when we get into it, we're going to see it's not right. They would be like, let's nationalize more industry. Let's have more state-owned industry. That is their actual policy program. And so they'll vote as part of what's called the Popular Front, right, with other like center leftists and other things like that, on things like protecting retirement, or protecting wages, wanting to raise the minimum. They'll vote for things like that, but their actual policy platform is, no, we need to go back to the way things were 40 years ago when the government owned tons of industry. Starting in the 1980s, really, you have this move towards privatization and deregulation, much as you had in the United States and in Great Britain. But in France, it was very, very heavily resisted. France is a much more statist society. They tend to look down on the American and British Anglos, the Anglo-Saxon capitalists, who are just reckless and don't believe in the rights of the individual because they just want everyone to be trampled by godless capitalism. There's a really interesting public poll where it was asking, like, what is your opinion of capitalism? Is capitalism good or bad? And it was, I gotta find it here. I want to get the numbers right. I don't want to misquote the French here, but yes. This was in 2010. Poll. Capitalism works well and should be kept. This is the position question. 55% of Americans said yes, which that's kind of scary. But 45% of Britons and Germans, 15% in France. 15%. They do not have a thriving history of free marketeers, which is interesting because this was actually where the term laissez-faire comes from. Laissez-faire, these were the mid-18th century French physiocrats who were trying to tell the French kings, look, if you want growth and economic activity like what's going on in Great Britain, you need to get the government out of the economy. You need to take down the barriers to trade. You need to get down the regulations, down the taxes. But that takes a fair bit of confidence in what you're doing, to just say, no, okay, I'll just let people do what they want to do. They want power. They want to keep hold of that and manage things.
So would you argue that if they would have gone more private earlier in like the French country, if they would have put a lot of their businesses more private and down the regulations, down the taxes, do you think that the French kingship would have been so in debt? And then I know that I'm not very familiar with French history, but isn't that why a lot of the kings fell, and why why the kingdom of France fell into a government? So do you think that making it more private would have helped continue the prosperity of France?
Well, yes and no, because it would have depended whether or not the government survived, because making those what we call structural adjustments then as now can be super unpopular. For example, a lot of the peasantry, you'd think, hey, peasants, you're no longer serfs anymore. You're now free. You're liberated to go make a living however you want. You'd think that sounds great, right? A lot of them were like, wait, what? This is terrible. You're saying I no longer have a right to be on this land. I no longer have a right to appeal to my lord for supplemental income, because if there was a bad harvest, you just went to the lord and you're like, hey, bad harvest, and he'd feed you. He'd feed your family. Now it was, you need to go find a different job. There's no welfare. You need to go out and make a living yourself. And so it is an adjustment period, right? And so it's a difficult question. I think probably it would have, gosh, that's such a counterfactual. I don't know. It would have made the French state wealthier in the long run. It's difficult to say whether or not what's called the Ancien Regime of the Bourbons could have survived, because so much of it was tied up in the state, and it was so hopelessly in debt, and so I just don't know that you could have. Yeah, maybe. I mean, they could have just defaulted on their debts. History. This Time is Different. It's a really good book if you want to read about. Anyone concerned about the national debt? Anyone concerned? This Time is Different. Oh. My markers just hate life. Like I keep the caps on them religiously, and they all die. This Time is Different. It is to look at the history of sovereign debt and defaults. And you find that these kings, every once in a while, they just be like, well, looks like we got ourselves in a pickle again. Time to just rip up all these IOUs, right? And there was nothing anyone could really do. So some of the great banking houses of Italy were destroyed when one of the English kings did that, because there was no way to get the money from the English king if you're some Italian banker. So, yeah, they could have done that. I don't know. It's an interesting question. I don't know. It's not part of the French political culture. It never has been. It's always been a very statist, centrally run society, one where sort of freewheeling initiative and private entrepreneurial activity, like there's no history of that. And we've seen the difficulty of just kind of remaking a society. We've tried going into countries with no history of democratic capitalism and just slapping down some institutions and saying, well, you guys should be rich and free in no time. And it worked in 0 cases, right? I mean, if you want to say it worked in Japan, that's fine. But that was also because the United States occupied it, and it was a small island. And they also had a history of entrepreneurship. That's something that's often left out of the story. So did Germany. France never did. France is much, I mean, that statistic there. Germans were like 4 times more likely to say that capitalism is great and we should keep it. And it's because there was a great history of private entrepreneurship and activity and capitalism in Germany, not in France. France was always highly centralized and statist and bureaucratized. So, the parties, yes. So this is what they look like. This is their orientation, and you can kind of tell based on where they are what they might favor. So you have your like super left wingers here, and they're part of what's called the Popular Front, and this includes the Greens down here. The Greens, they're the ecologist party. They have very little power here, but they're all part of what's called the Popular Front. Okay, so they basically join together in like a big leftist bloc, essentially to keep these guys out of power. The National Rally, who we're going to talk about here, because they've grown more and more prominent over the years. And then you have sort of the center-right guys. These are if you look at page 87, you'll see them start talking about the Gaullists and the neo-Gaullists. This is kind of like their Republicans. These are kind of your statist, nationalists, kind of center-right guys who they don't mind if the government regulates the economy as long as it's in the interest of national power and greatness, not like useless welfare payments and stuff like that. That's how they talk. Except when it comes to things like Social Security, which when we talk about the age of retirement stuff, that's the same stuff that brings all the French people out into the streets. Except for this really tiny little group here called the Ensemble, and when we look, they're the yellow right here, right? They're a centrist party. Oh, sorry, I went the wrong way. That's Macron's people right there, right? And as you can see, they've been able to bribe some of the center right. See, there's the center right. They don't hold enough seats to really be important at all, unless they kind of party along with. See who they are right here. So they basically bandwagon here with the centrists, with Macron's guys here, and see they pull some of these guys here too. And in that way, they're able to consolidate enough seats to hold a plurality. The problem with plurality is it's not a majority, right? That's the real problem with plurality, is it's not a majority. And so you have to be very careful. And of course, the government was just destroyed last month because, well, I'll get to that, I suppose. I'll say that right now. Their debt. Macron has been in power now since 2018. He has tried various things to balance the books. That's his whole program. Can I raise some taxes? No. Can I cut some spending? No. Then COVID comes along, and spending goes crazy in France, just like it went crazy everywhere. And now, for instance, borrowing costs are enormous. They're actually violating the European Union's rules on how much your debt can be as a percentage of your GDP. And unlike in the United States, which has an enormous economy, vast material wealth, a very liquid bond market, that's not France's situation. France's situation is not one of a global superpower whose currency underwrites the world. That's not the situation. So their debt to GDP ratio, I believe, is now over 60, which is approaching serious danger. This time is different. That book, it basically argues that once you hit about the 90% mark, it's something bad's going to happen. Either you're going to have a crisis, or your economy is going to go into a perilous stagnation, akin to like what Japan has been in for the last all of your lifetimes, I guess. Once upon a time, Japan was a huge economic powerhouse. Did you know that? Back in the 1980s, if you went to the bookstore, you would find books that were like, When Japan Rules America. What do you know? We defeated them in World War II, they're back and they've conquered us. I'm so serious. Because now if you go to the bookstore, it's like China. China's gonna rule us. Back if you went to the bookstore in the 1980s, it was like Japan. Japan's gonna conquer us. I'm so serious. You don't believe me, but go look. It hasn't been that difficult, I swear. So, he finally just said, look, we can't get you guys to agree on a budget. We're just, because you want input. When you have such an unstable governing situation here, and you know your government could collapse at any moment, you don't want to force things through the National Assembly and just go over their heads. You can. It's in the Constitution. You can do it. But it's understood that it's going to rub people the wrong way. But they just would not agree to what Macron and his team essentially decided was necessary, which was to raise some taxes and cut some spending and start trying to make some kind of headway in dealing with France's perilous financial position, and that was the last straw. They lost the vote by, I think it was, they needed 288 for a vote of no confidence, and they got like 340 or something like that. So they got crushed. They had defections even from inside their own ranks. So, because you, as a member of the National Assembly, you've got to go back and face the voters here, more than likely. So do you want to vote with the government that's raising your taxes and cutting your benefits? No way. You want to go back and do that? Guys have tried. They just won't listen to you. I was there for you. I was speaking for you. So, politics. It's all the same. It's all the same. So Macron, he's safe. He's safe until 27? 27, is that right? 28. Yeah, 28. But he's a lame duck. He's a lame duck here. He's second term, can't run again. So he's trying to get the ship righted here, but I don't think that's in the offing. I don't think that's going to happen. Again, the evolution of this. Initially, when de Gaulle set this up, essentially the president just named everyone and just ran this entire thing. But over the decades, it's essentially become sort of a power sharing here, especially when you have coalitions, right? At one point, for example, Macron, this was a couple of years ago, they really relied on a lot of left votes to get in power. And so there was a lot of pressure on him to pick a prime minister who was from the left-wing coalition. And he didn't want to do that because this is the person that really kind of runs the government and picks the ministers and stuff. And so he was very resistant. It almost led to the government collapsing. And he gambled that they would not collapse the government because of fear of the national rally, the right-wingers. I'm going to get to them in just a second here. Here we go. So the national rally, how we're elected. Yeah, okay. So that's how the actual government is run. How they're actually elected, and I'll talk about the national rally in the context of the present politics here, because I've mentioned them several times, I know, and you're just dying to know who are these people. Let me talk really quick about the actual elections here. Okay. We have here, and just a quick note on this. Oops. Just like in the United States, less so in the United States, but definitely we talk about this in the context of Great Britain. Also the case in France. The people that you appoint here as ministers, just like in the United States too, really, like these are political allies, right? A lot of them have never been elected to anything. They're just loyalists who are going to head this department, and really all the actual governing is going to be done by technocrats. Now, if you go into your book and you read pages, where is it? From 101 to 104, they talk about just how intense this is in France. There are just a handful of schools who literally produce all the technocrats, all the bureaucrats, and that's how it is. So it's very, very rigorous. There's some fun, they put a couple of fun example questions on there, which I'll get to. But okay, first I was talking about this electoral system. So the electoral system. Single member districts with a runoff. Okay? So, single member districts, so just like the United States and Great Britain, it's not a proportional representation system. We're going to get to one of those here soon. So, single member districts, but instead of just a simple plurality, we have first past the post, right? That means even if you only got 39%, you still win, right? To win in the first round, of the election, just spoiler, there's a second round. To win in the first round, you have to win an outright majority, which is not likely. It's just not likely. You know, unless you sit in a very, very safe seat where your party is dominant, has a stranglehold, you're probably facing the likelihood of a second. So, the top candidates will then face head-to-head in a runoff. So if nobody wins the 50%, then they have a runoff. Okay? It's a week later, and it's the top two candidates. Although sometimes you'll get a third voter, but that person, it's kind of rare because in order to be included in the runoff, you have to have gotten over 12.5% in the first round, and just mathematically, it's just very hard for someone to have gotten 12.5% if nobody got a majority, and there's all these different parties. So it's very, very rare. And a lot of times what will happen is they'll say, listen, remember we talked about all these coalitions. They'll say, look, I know you're going to get 12.5%, you know, but if you do that, you're going to split the vote in the runoff, and you're going to give it to the right winger who we don't like, right? This is something the National Rally has been saying for years now, at least since 2021, 2022. And definitely in 2023, they were saying, look, it was only because of party politicking that we didn't win a majority. And it was true. I remember watching the coverage in the run-up to it. It was like, yeah, they might actually win an outright majority in Parliament. And there was very desperate politicking there. And deals were being very open to cut. Like if you ever heard like The Economist magazine, you can find it on newsstands, like a politics magazine for Europe. They do cover the Americas too, and they were talking openly about how there's a lot of hand-wringing going on right now because, you know, they're trying to figure out and make deals like, okay, you'll run in this district head-to-head against the National Rally candidate, and you'll run against them head-to-head in this one. And in this way, we'll make sure that they're in the minority so we can exclude them from government. So the idea here so you've got the socialists and all their people coming in towards the center. Then you have Macron and his people who are, and this is going to be this. I'll be more interesting. We're going to say that this is kind of the center of French politics. So Macron is kind of straddling that line. He's definitely leaning a little bit on the left. You've got the Republicans over. Three more of you. Macron. You got the Republican. You've got the Republicans. These are the old Gaullists. These are the old center-right Republicans I was talking about. And there's a great little explanation here about conservatism in France versus in the United States. Sorry, I'm trying to find it. 118, where they talk about, look, in the United States, in Great Britain, when we talk about conservatives, they're going to talk a lot about whatever else they do in politics, in actual power. Their rhetoric is, we need to get the government isn't the solution to the problem, the government is the problem. That's my Ronald Reagan, right? That's, no, I'm not doing the old give her justice there, but whatever, in a very pleasant voice, whatever. That's not how French conservatives talk. French conservatives do not talk in terms of like, we need to get the government out of the economy and stuff like that. That's just not how they talk. It's much more about national power, sovereignty, those types of things. So when I talk about like the conservatives, like the Republicans, these are the old Gaullists and neo-Gaullists. And that's them. They're the center right. CR, center right. And Macron is kind of, here's the center. He's a center left. Again, kind of like a Clintonite liberal type of guy. And then you have like the socialists and communists and the Greens over here. Okay? You got most of the labor unions in here. All the labor vote is right in here. Sort of in between those, right? And then over here, we have the National Rally. Oh, I wrote National Front. They used to be called the National Front. Whatever. National Front, National Rally. In the great tradition of French politics, you have to change the name of your party every 20 or 30 years or so. So, just not to be too passe. Okay, so the idea here, for the last 15 years, the idea has been to do anything that it takes to form governments without letting them into power. Okay? So, out of these groupings here, all the way from the far left to the center right, they have to cut deals between themselves in order to be able to exclude the National Front from the National Rally from politics. Why? Okay. Yeah.
I was gonna ask why.
Why? Okay. So, on page, hold on a second. Here. 107. 107 is where they talk about it right here. They have that beautiful illustration there. I know you've all been just sitting up at night by candlelight, just poring over this book. It's so wonderful. Here's the thing. France, the political establishment, the business establishment, they are all married to this thing called the European Union. Okay? It is that thing, it is further integration with Europe that this party has long opposed. Before Marine Le Pen, her father was the head of the party. Now it's her, Marine Le Pen. Okay? And they're right populists. They complain about immigration. They complain about bureaucrats and how the out-of-touch elite don't care about them. But again, they're not opposed to things like welfare spending. So I don't want you to think of them as like right populists in the way that like the Tea Party, remember the Tea Party Republican movement? They're not like that. They don't care that the government is spending out of control. When Macron says he's gonna raise the retirement age, they're right out there with everybody else saying, boo, see, the elites hate you. We would never treat you that way. We would take care of good Frenchmen. So they're right populists, okay? But because they are Euro-skeptic, EU-skeptic, largely for that reason alone, they are kept out of government. Largely for that reason. Again, the EU is... Maybe I should devote a serious chunk of a class to talk about the EU and why it matters and why it's so controversial to a growing number of people who just feel like they aren't seeing the benefits that were promised by further European integration. Because if you look in the book, they talk about how initially European integration, because we did talk about the early steps of European integration last week in the context of Brexit, right? Remember, it started out as the European Coal and Steel Community and then as the Economic Community.
And France experiences tremendous economic growth, the best economic growth it's ever enjoyed in its history in the 30 years after World War II, when these institutions start growing. But really, since the 1990s, that growth has the growth really stopped in the late 1970s when you had things. Really, it was global stuff. I mean, you had the oil shock. If you're familiar with the oil shock, oil went from being here to being here. I mean, the price of oil like quintuples in a couple of years. And like you think about all the carry-on effects that has across industry. So there were a whole bunch of different reasons, and they tried to do the same things that the British tried to do under Thatcher, that the U.S. government started doing under Jimmy Carter. I'm always going to mention it. Jimmy Carter was the one who deregulated the airlines and the trucking industry and started lowering the corporate tax rate. I'm just saying, everyone acts like Ronald Reagan came up with all these ideas. Let's hear it for the peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia. Moment of silence. He just died recently. Mm-hmm. So, should be noted, anytime I say anything nice about any political leader, should be known. I'm just leaving out all of the negative things I would say too, but I don't want to be too cynical. So, they are not able to do these structural reforms. Things like privatizing whole industries, deregulating all of these things, cutting into, remember Reagan, he breaks the air traffic controllers, right? These are unionized government employees, and he just crushes them. At the same time, Margaret Thatcher does the same thing in England. That does not happen in France. That literally has never happened, and I don't think will ever happen. Even when they did start privatizing things to try and get the economy going, because they realized, gosh, we have all these inefficient, dead, they call them zombie companies. You have them in other economies, but like it's basically where a company is very inefficient, a business or corporation is very inefficient, it cannot compete in the marketplace, and so government support keeps it in business. And were these subsidies is just a way of saying the government is giving your money to them to stay in business. If that money ever was taken away and would die, it's being artificially kept alive. So much of that was going on. It's one of the things that the Chinese economy has been struggling through over the last 20 years. These are called SOEs in China. Actually, China is one of our case studies, so I won't say too much. But the state-owned enterprises. These are very politically connected, large firms who employ a ton of people. And so when you go after these things, it's like, gosh, it's such a drain on the economy because those resources could be used more efficiently elsewhere, and you have these tax dollars propping it up. But they're politically connected, and there could be some unemployment. We talked about short term, there's going to be some adjustments, right? You need what's called labor market fluidity. Now, this is a technical term for meaning you need to be able to fire people and make them go find a new job and make it easy for them to find a new job. France does not have that. And if you look at page 119, labor force rigidities. French unemployment, long been a huge problem. But French firms are very reluctant to hire new employees, at least officially. So there's a huge amount of like under the table work that happens here. Okay? Because French employers pay tons in taxes. And they have to pay huge severance pay. If they lay you off for any reason, even if the economy hits a downturn, it's like, guys, we gotta tighten our belts here, we gotta make some layoffs here. You're on the hook for like most of their salary, even once they're gone. And so French firms are very reluctant to hire people. It's very expensive. It involves a ton of red tape. So they don't hire as many people as they would. They don't invest in human capital the way that they would. They hire a lot of people under the table, or they just move to Eastern Europe, where there's just less rules and regulation and cheaper labor costs, and less unions. If you read about, because 22% of the French workforce is still in the public sector, one of the highest in Europe. The French government has majority ownership in over 1,000 different private sector businesses, telecoms, railways, just all these different things. Which again, as an American, it's like, why does the government why is the government owning this and operating this? Again, it's this history of centralized state control. They had no thriving history of private entrepreneurial culture. When the railroads needed to be built, the government built the railroads. It wasn't like in England, where some capitalists got together and were like, "Jolly good, man, let's slap down some tracks here." That's exactly what happened too. No, no. So it's different, and it's hard to explain because being in the Anglosphere here, it's like, well, what's the problem here? You just cut these regulations and make it easier for them to hire some people and stuff. But the French don't want that. And anytime a government tries to do that, they get voted out of office. So it's not like the politicians are the problem. I would argue someone like Emmanuel Macron, for all the ways you could criticize and complain about him, is easily the one with the ideas. But the guy who did a lot of the privatization of the state-owned industries was a socialist. It was in the late 90s, early 2000s, and he was doing it in stealth mode. Where he's saying we are not privatizing anything like those heartless capitalists. We're just changing the ownership structure of the corporation to something, and just stealth privatizing. Doing it stealth mode, because he knew that if he said those words, it would be over. And it's the same way today. So that is one of the big ones here. And again, so you have these coalitions of center and center left who are trying to solve these lingering problems, structural inefficiencies. The French economy is just not structurally competitive. And if they were to leave the EU, the safe, warm harbor of the EU, because that's really what it is. When the financial crisis happened and the European debt crisis, a lot of those thrifty Belgian and Dutch were like, why are we paying to subsidize French agriculture anyway? All these basically small-holding peasant farmers. They're a very powerful constituency in France. And they say, look, if you want us to be part of the European Union, we want protection for we don't want to get dumped cheap grain and stuff from other parts of Europe onto us. We want protection. Well, that has to be paid for by someone else, and it is. And so it's, to leave there would be horrible. I mean, name a powerful French tech company. Go.
Apple.
Right? There's nothing. Right? And it's not a knock on the French, but they're not an economy or a society that is geared toward innovation. All their brightest people go to these universities that I mentioned to be state bureaucrats, to work in these heavily protected firms shielded by the state, which is fine. I like France, it's fine. But much like Italy, it's got its beautiful boutique corporations that make really fine luxury goods and stuff, but they're not going to compete against a massive American or Chinese company ever, right? And so the European Union is really, if you're a French leader or a French producer, you're thinking this is a safe harbor here, and it's one of the reasons that they try very hard to keep the national rally out, right? Because it's not like there aren't places of overlap there, but the notion, what really scared them was Brexit, because Brexit seemed impossible. It was a ploy vote that David Cameron called just to get the crazy conservatives off track, and then it happened, and it was like, oh my gosh, this could actually happen to us too, and so that is why they are very desperate to keep them out of power. Whether or not they will be able to remains to be seen, because the French are complaining that there's too much unemployment. The government is running these huge deficits, but at the same time, they're not letting them raise taxes. They're not letting them cut spending. And so the car just keeps going in the same direction, and they're punishing anyone who tries to steer the car away, even though when you ask them, they're like, well, we need to do it. And so eventually, it remains to be seen. We'll see what happens in the forthcoming elections here. We'll see whether or not, as you're watching these elections, which I know you're all going to be watching now, because you're like, oh my God, I have to know what happens next about the future of France. This critical place, and you're going to watch for the German elections too. Watch that too. Which Germany's next week. Yes?
You said something about the EU with grain prices. Is that why there's farmer protests in France?
Oh, well, that's,
Or is that
no, because you're trying, well, so what's happening there is you have other interest groups, right, on the left, who tend to be environmentalists, right? And what do the environmentalists want to talk about?
Cut carbon.
Cut carbon emissions. And do you know what some of the primary ingredients in a lot of fertilizer. Do you know what the petrochemical fertilizer? It uses petroleum products, petrochemical fertilizer. And so they want the farmers to be reined in from using petrochemical fertilizers because it increases greenhouse gas emission. And then, of course, there's the fact that raising animal livestock, which in a place like the Danes are very famous for their wonderful cows and their dairy products and stuff, well, their flatulence, if you will, emits too much methane. And so we need to slaughter all the cows and eat bugs instead. Yeah, that is a thing, though. That is a thing. Yeah, that we need to embrace eating insects and stop using animal husbandry because methane is such a powerful greenhouse gas. If you want a book on it, I read a book on it. It's called The Vegetarian Imperative. Forget the guy's name. I read it, oh gosh, 10, 15 years ago. That's the argument, anyway, is that if we don't all start being vegetarians, we're going to boil the planet alive because eating too much meat and too much methane gets released into the air and yada yada yada. So I'll let you read the book. I know you're all dying to read that book. I've given it such a beautiful plug. I should really tag the author in this video and let them know. So, but yeah, and just you look at some of the things that they've tried to do. It's just, oh my gosh, like the one thing that they do have right is nuclear power. Nuclear power. If there's one thing you should know about France, it's that if you look at it on the map there, France, lacking in coal, lacking in natural gas, lacking in oil, basically for better or worse, they've embraced nuclear. And nuclear energy, if there's going to be a prosperous future beyond petroleum, I think probably it has to be nuclear, unless Tony Stark invents something else. Yeah, so nuclear power, that's a big thing in France, and it's not even controversial either. The Greens here, who you see at the very bottom there, they complain about it, but as you can see, they have exactly zero power at all. So, big problems. Really high youth unemployment, and this is a persistent thing because you have these labor force rigidities and so much state employment. And again, they've tried to loosen it up where they said like, you can avoid our laws that we have on the books if the person is under 26. So hire whoever you want. If they're under 26 and the economy, goes into a downturn, you can fire them without incurring the penalties. And these are the kind of reforms that the government is thinking to try to work around the problems that are inbuilt. And so basically what we have here, Marine Le Pen, structural adjustment. This means that the economy and the labor force is just not producing enough stuff, basically, right? Especially when you consider how much the French people say they want. They want to retire at 62. They want to have nice pensions and long vacations and subsidized food. If you go to a grocery store there, one thing you'll find is you'll go through the grocery store and you're grabbing everything. You're putting it all in the cart, whatever. And you're walking through the store and you're like, gosh, this is going to be like at least a couple $100, right? Maybe $300, I don't know. You're not looking at the prices. You get to the register and they check you out and it's like 70 euros or something. And it's like, what? Yeah, and it's because of agricultural policy. It's heavily subsidized. So it's very cool, if you're a tourist there. But that all has to be paid for. That all has to be paid for. And so structural adjustments. When countries in the developing world is what they call it, Argentina gets into trouble. Their debt is out of control. The government is facing a crisis. Who do they call? They call in the IMF, right? The International Monetary Fund. They call them in and they say, we need a loan, we need a bailout, right? And what does the IMF do? The IMF imposes conditions. They say, okay, we'll bail you out, but you need to cut public spending by 15%, you need to increase revenue by 5%, and you need to show us a balanced budget with these conditions for 5 years after that. These are like serious, and these are things that you as an elected politician can't campaign on, right? You can't campaign on doing that, cutting spending and raising taxes. You all know this, you can't campaign on that. Emmanuel Macron can't campaign on, that's not what he campaigns on. Understand, when I say that like Emmanuel Macron has the right ideas, when he is on the campaign trail, he says things like, we will keep France strong and take care of those who need us and be a pillar for Europe and provide prosperity, right? Like things every politician says, right? But when he actually gets into office, he's then faced with trying to make structural adjustments. But everything I've been talking about, from slightly raising the retirement age to slightly lowering the minimum wage, any of those things, those are structural adjustments. Stripping away some labor laws, but these are things that are met with pushback on all sides. And so the situation continues to get worse. Obviously, the French could not call in the IMF. Probably would be the ECB, the European Central Bank. But then again, huge conditions are imposed. If you go look at Greece, who back in 2010 needed a bailout from the ECB, the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank did not just fork over the money. They did just what the IMF said. You can think of the ECB as being kind of like the IMF of the EU. They said, well, your public spending is out of control. You need to cut it. It's not that the politicians didn't know that the public spending was out of control. They just couldn't do it and stay in office. And so that's one of the problems of democratic politics is, it's difficult to divide up the pie. One thing that they're trying to do, and that this is, people like the National Rally try and paint it like, well, the problem is immigrants. That's one of their big things is immigrants. Immigrants are the problem. One of the problems, the elites who don't care about us and the immigrants. So that's one of their big ones. And when you look at like the birth rates in Europe, they're just not having babies. They're just not having babies at a fast enough rate to pay for their welfare states. And so if you're not willing to bring in immigrants, but you're also not willing because of welfare state, you see how it's just not going to work, right? And so that's basically the argument of this bloc here, this united front who's trying to prevent the National Rally from winning, but they keep failing. They keep failing. Things keep getting worse, And so if there's a group who's trying to fix things and they're not able to fix it, eventually the alternative just starts to look attractive. So, and that's the situation we're in right now. Like I said, Macron finally just bit the bullet and said, we're doing it, just go over the heads of the National Assembly. They produced a budget that the National Assembly hated. They were censured, lost a vote of no confidence, and now there will be new elections. And we'll see whether or not this coalition comes back together. Because you know what? This grouping over here, as you can see all these seats here who joined with him, a lot of them were not thrilled with Macron's style of governance. And of course, these guys over here were not happy at all. And so it'll be interesting to see whether or not there is that same kind of collaboration pre-election to prevent the National Rally from winning these districts. Because if you go back and look at the election returns, yeah, if there hadn't been all those deals made and stuff, it would have been very close to an outright majority for the National Rally. So yeah, if you're interested, look up National Rally, Marine Le Pen. Keep an eye for elections. We'll obviously talk about this more in the context of Germany next week. France's frenemy. They're frenemies now. We made them friends, which is fun. But they are the twin pillars of the European Union. And Italy is like the third largest economy in the European Union. And like Italy's economy is like nothing. 20% of it is like tourism. And it's one of the reasons he mentions this in here. He's rather rude about it, I think. I'll say that. The guy who wrote this book, by the way, is an old is an old, he taught at American University, PhD, American University, but he was also a U.S. diplomat. So he was a foreign service officer. So he's like through and through, Team America. And here, he's talking, and this is on page 117. Every once in a while, he just sounds like such an American every once in a while. He's talking about the French economy and just how structurally uncompetitive it is. And he says, you got all these small shopkeepers and farmers, right? And if you go to France or Italy or even to Germany, one thing that they're really excited to show you as a tourist is their local things. Like this wine, it's only grown here. Like this type of grape, it's been grown here forever, and we use the wood from these casks, and it's aged in this way, and there's this cheese. It's all very, very local. He's saying, you just have all these small shopkeepers and farmers who they just don't want to be run over by Walmart. They can't compete, and they're just angry that Walmart's going to take them over, and they're just, quote, hopeless and reactionary. Hopelessly reactionary, he says, because they don't want to join Team America and the globalized McDonald's economy. They want to have their little niche, beautiful potteries and, all those great things. I'll admit it, I love it. That's one of my favorite things about it. They're not going to be an economic powerhouse, but the intense artisanal perfection and individual care is just not, they're not mass-produced goods. What's that bag everybody loves? Help me out. What are those bags? They're a French bag? Hermes? Hermes? Yeah, they take years to make those bags. They take years to make those bags by hand. Like there's a wait list out years to get one of these bags. Because they literally make them by hand. And they refuse to expand or, contract out or anything. And that's the culture there. It's, yeah. You laugh at my awful French. Someone had to do it. Fine. Everybody have a good laugh. Go get your Hermes bags and go laugh. All right. If you have any questions, please let me know. Some of you have topics picked out. Email me your topics. I'm not going to be breathing down your neck about it. I just want to know, are you thinking about topics? Think about it. Think about topics for a paper. It can be from this book. It can just be something you thought of.
What do you mean by topic?
The topical paper. A short topical paper. You'll find it in the syllabus. Not to worry. Good to know. Good to know. Indeed. No, it's the same way. It'll just be like during finals.
Everything there, there is thing or no?